Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 29, where we read about the voice of the Lord. The superscription is Psalm of David, and that's actually going to be an integral part of this particular psalm. It's going to be significant that David is the one that brings us to it. We'll come back and we'll look at that. But notice how we start off: ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty; ascribe to the Lord glory and strength; ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name, and then worship the Lord in holy array. Notice that first set of ascribes, and that's seen three times. There's a lot of repetition in the psalm. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Now that phrase, B'nai Elim, sounds a little bit like B'nai Elohim, but that's not Elohim. That's just Elim. El is one of the words for God. You could say the full length Elohim. This is just Elim. The im part is plural, so that's sons. If you want to translate it, sons of the mighty, you would have to say sons of the mighty ones, because it's the plural form there. So B'nai Elim. The King James renders this give unto the Lord. By the way, when it says ascribe, Nathan is the verb there. I would say give to the Lord three times in all three of these. It's the same Hebrew word. And the King James actually simplified it like that. It means the same thing. When you ascribe to something, you're giving credit to that. Uh, give unto the Lord. Notice when it says, "Oh, ye mighty." Now, people that like the King James sometimes don't recognize what's so good about the King James. One of the good things, when you see the word ye instead of you or thou would be singular, ye is plural. So, ye mighty, plural, ye mighty ones. Is what the King James is saying, although not everybody who reads the King James gets that, and that's probably unfortunate. The NIV renders this: ascribe to the Lord, you heavenly beings. And they're trying to catch that Elim part. Yes, El can be the mighty one, but it's also the word that's typically used for God, or in this case, God's plural. And that's why the NIV, they're being interpretive, but they might be right. You heavenly beings, you godlike, you sort of godlike beings. Notice the call is almost like what we would see when we refer to the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. Remember how that's used in the book of Job, where it refers to, sounds like it refers to angels. And people have thought, well, maybe there's that passage in Genesis 6, and that might refer to angels too. And of course, there's a big debate on that. We're not going there right now. We continue. Notice, ascribe to the Lord the glory due to His name. Now, the Hebrew there, kabod shmu, is the Hebrew, and that word kabod, by the way, notice how our translators have put in the glory, not just the glory of His name. That's how I would probably render it, but that can mean, when you say the glory of His name, the glory due to His name. Again, being a little interpretive there. Translators can't help it but do that on occasion. But literally, it's the glory of His name. The word glory there, kabod, bears a bit of conversation because that term, we think glory, we think majesty, magnificence, and that those all work. But Hebrew is a bit more concrete than that. And so literally that word kabod means something that's heavy. In fact, I seem to recall it's used over in the book of Judges, where you had Eglon, that nasty old king from Moab, who came in and invaded and set up his camp in Jericho, and he was fat and heavy, and he'd grown fat stealing from the Israelites. Well, there it was in a negative sense. Here it's in a positive sense. When you speak of glory, literally that's heavy. In other words, he's significant. That his name is significant and it's worthy because they counted value by how heavy something was. Gold is a heavier metal than, say, iron or copper or things like that. And so they considered something value by how heavy it was. And even in modern speech, sometimes we'll say, "Hey, man, that's heavy." And what we mean by that, that's really significant. That's really powerful. And so it's even entered into our speech today. So ascribe to the Lord, glory to His name. Notice, worship the Lord. Now, when I'm not going to go into the Hebrew, but when you say that in Hebrew, the idea of worship, yes, we think of prayer and praise, and that's true. But literally, the word for worship in Hebrew is to bow down, to prostrate yourself, to put your head down, and we've gotten a bit away from that. And I suppose that's okay, but we shouldn't forget the connection there. That worship involves, yes, the heart and soul. Remember how Jesus said the Father looks for those who would worship Him in spirit and in truth, and not just in body location. But perhaps we've gone to the other extreme. And I think it's good at times for Christians to bow down and get physically into worship, because where the body is, the soul and spirit tend to follow along. And so notice, worship the Lord, but not just worship the Lord in holy array. Now, does that mean we're supposed to dress a certain way? Well, maybe, or maybe it's an attitude that goes with this. You see, this part of the psalm, we said it's a psalm of David, but it's actually repeated, or actually, can I say, maybe this is the repetition. Maybe originally, you see, I'm not sure which came first, but we see this portion of the psalm way back in the book of Chronicles. In First Chronicles chapter 16, verses 28 and 29, the context here, David he's the king, and he's bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. The temple hasn't been built yet, but the Ark will be placed there in a special place. And as he brings the people in, and as he brings the Ark in, he sings a song, and a portion of that song is given right here in these verses. It's the larger context is more of the song. I'm not going to read the whole song here. Ascribe to the Lord, and notice that's the part that we've seen so far. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. Word for word, what we just saw with regard to glory, the glory of His name. But then we continue, bring an offering and come before Him. And notice this last line is straight out of our psalm as well. Worship the Lord, there it is, in holy array. Now, the priests were in special garments. They would wear priestly garments as they're moving the ark. David, not so much so. In fact, he might have been a bit underdressed. You remember how he was dancing before the Lord and sort of stripped down to his undergarments. And I'm not saying he's in his BVDs, his underwear, but he had taken his outer cloak off, and maybe a bit more. We're not sure exactly how much. I don't think it was indecent, but I do think that it was so that he could engage completely in worship, just like we talked about bowing down, engaging physically in worship. And David got physically involved in the worship at this time. And so all those things are wrapped up here as David sings about worshiping the Lord in holy array. Now, our psalm continues that we're not going to follow David's original song over there in Chronicles. The voice of the Lord is upon the waters, the God of glory. And notice the reference to waters. Now, it's plural. Actually, it's dual. Whenever you say it in Hebrew, it's always dual. You can't say there's not like a drop of water. When you speak of water, it's always in dual. That's just the way you say it in Hebrew. But our translators rendered it in the plural because of what we're going to see in the next two lines. Notice the God of glory thunders, and that calls to mind sort of a thunder and lightning. And that imagery is going to continue all the way to the end of the psalm. So I'm going to leave the picture up because the imagery will continue. The Lord is over many waters. This is why I said that the translators rendered it plural, because when you put the word many, now you've expanded it. And then we have the second repetition. The voice of the Lord again is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. We're going to continue. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. This is storm language. Think storms where the wind blows and the lightning strikes. Yes, the Lord breaks in pieces. Notice he breaks the cedars. He breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. So the cedars is repeated and then expanded, because that's where cedars came from. You didn't have cedars in those are big tall trees. You didn't have them in Israel as much as you had them to the north of Israel, where it becomes much more forested. And then, having mentioned Lebanon, verse 6, he makes Lebanon skip like a calf. Again, think storms. Think the trees are swaying, and you're sort of visualizing the animals jumping, and Syrian like a young wild ox. Now, Syrian is what the Phoenicians called Mount Hermon. That's as far north as you can be and still be in Israel. It's the mountain that borders both the northern part of Israel, but also the eastern side of Lebanon, where the Phoenicians live, the land of the Phoenicians. So Sirion, like a young wild ox. And then notice again, the voice of the Lord hews out flames of fire. That's not talking volcanoes. That's still that imagery of the lightning and the thunder and the fire that comes forth from heaven. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. What does that remind you of? It reminds me of what happened when the Israelites were in the wilderness. Remember how they came to the Mount Sinai, and the wilderness began to shake, and the mountain and the lightning and thunder and earthquakes and things at the giving of the law. And in case we didn't catch that, the Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. Kadesh was the place where after Sinai they went up to Kadesh, and they tried to go into the promised land, the story with the spies, and they didn't. So just by mentioning the wilderness of Kadesh, you're sort of pulled in there. He shakes the wilderness. He shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. Verse 9, the voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve. It's so much that here's a deer that's ready to give birth, and the lightning strikes, and boom, it happens. And strips the forest bare. And remember, this is that language of both in Israel, and we had for a bit the imagery of the wilderness. But when you talk forest, we're back in the areas of Lebanon. And in his temple, notice how it's been escalating bigger and bigger and louder. The voice of the Lord does this. The voice of the Lord does this. And in his temple, everything says kabod. Everything says glory. That's you can almost end the psalm right here, but it doesn't end. There's actually a couple more verses. And yet there's a climactic point right here. And in his temple, everything says glory. Now let's finish up the last two verses. The Lord sat as king at the flood. Now notice the Lord sat. That's going to be our repetition. Yes, the Lord sits as king forever. Now, with regard to the tense, in Hebrew, sometimes it's the context that tells you what the tense is. You have what's called a perfect and an imperfect, and these are both perfects. So technically, you could say the Lord sat as king of the flood. Yes, the Lord sat. But when you say forever, that's not past tense. That's that's present and going on into the future. So translators have rendered it correctly. Notice that first, the Lord sat as king. The term as king is italicized. That means it's not in the original text, but it is in the original text when you get to the second line. And so they included it as in the first line to explain what sitting does. And when a king sits, he is showing that he has his authority. He's firmly seated on the throne. And notice, the Lord sat as king. He sits as king forever, but he sat as king at the flood. And I want to suggest that we're still in the thunderstorm imagery. Now, when you say at the flood, that particular Hebrew term that's used here for the flood, every other place it's used in the entire Bible always refers not just as any old flood, but to the flood in the days of Noah, the flood that destroyed all the world. And so he sat as king. He showed that he is king back then. He showed that he was the victorious one reigning, and he still sits as king forever. And now in verse 11, here's how we close the psalm. The Lord will give strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. Notice how you end with peace. That's how the story of the flood ended. It ended, of course, after the destruction, There was that sign of peace. Remember how the dove, and even today, a dove with a twig coming back is used as a sign, almost like cross-culturally, a sign of peace. And the Lord will bless his people with peace. And of course, that's how the story of the flood ends. Remember, God gives a rainbow and he promises peace. I'm no longer going to destroy the earth with a flood. I'm going to take my bow, sort of a bow and arrow theme. I'm going to take my bow and set it in the clouds. And somebody actually pointed out one time that the bow's pointed at him. If you shoot an arrow through that bow, it's going actually toward the Lord, because the Lord entered into a covenant saying, I will never again destroy the world with a flood. He has blessed his people with peace. Now, there's a sense in which Jesus came to do the same thing. Jesus came, suffered on our behalf in order to bring peace. And it's after the cross that we see coming the crown. That was true with Jesus, but it's also true with us. Are you going through difficult times? That's okay. Yes, they're difficult, but after the cross comes the crown. After the trouble comes the peace. And we have God's promise that he is coming again. And after the cross comes the crown. So you wait for that. You hope for that. You trust in him, what he accomplished in the past, but also what he has promised to accomplish in the future.